You couldn't call your periodical anarchist, you couldn't call yourself anarchist, you couldn't use the word in anything but a pejorative sense. So he invented the word libertarian. And it's since been expropriated, or appropriated if you like, by the right wing. We have to reclaim that word again because it has a much richer history and a much richer meaning. So when I use that word from here on in, please bear in mind the sense in which I am using it. Now getting back to what I wanted to say. We have to reconsider the whole question of this. How are we going to create not only the forms of empowerment or forms of freedom, how also are we going to recover the libertarian tradition, the underside of history, as Elise Goulding put it in a magnificent book on feminism and the hidden history of women. The underside of history that has always existed in all movements and in all struggles, and bring that to the surface again so that people can recognize their own traditions which have been buried under or snowed under the razzle-dazzle of the academy, that have been snowed under the razzle-dazzle of official history and even of socialist history, where they're more concerned with talking about the fight between parties than they are between the people and their rulers. And one has only to consult most socialist histories in order to find out what they're really talking about are not the people. They're talking about socialist versus non-socialist, anarchist versus non-anarchist, capitalist versus democratic parties. That's what they argue about. How are we going to recover that libertarian dimension? And not only that libertarian dimension and tradition, with the forms that people spontaneously created in great moments of social change, of radical change. How are we going to recover that? What are we going to learn from it? What were the forms that they created? How do they apply to our own times? I will not go back 2,500 years ago. I could even go back to the tribal world and say that there the real libertarian history of humanity is to be located. Among the Iroquois Confederation, among various sororal groups that women formed in so-called primitive societies. And there's a marvelous work on that, by the way, The Women of the Forest, which is very compelling and is forced into the format of male history and male anthropology, while all the data contradicts the conclusions. How women form their own society apart from men living in the men's house. Yolanda Murphy wrote it, but unfortunately her husband was there too. So it begins to be placed within the format of academic anthropology. I could go into that in great detail, and I have a great deal to do with the Akwesasne people, the so-called Iroquois Confederacy, okay? I could go into Greece, which was wrong in a million ways. Patriarchy, slavery, and war. Agonistic mentalities, competitive outlooks. But one thing at least created certain forms, one grandiose town meeting, so to speak, in Athens around 450 BC, from which we can learn, not on which we will model ourselves. There is nothing on which we can model ourselves. I could go into the medieval commune, which did not mean communism. It really meant town or city council, and give you endless examples of that. I'm doing a book right now for the Sierra Club, which rolls that whole carpet out, particularly with reference to municipal life. The early towns, even as early as Sumeria, were built around face-to-face democracies, which later turned into hierarchical state-type structures. I could do that. I don't want to burden you with that, because it would take hours to talk about. I could talk about the magnificent revolutionary sections in Paris in 1793 to 1794. And here I just have to pause because it's so breathtakingly fascinating. They took the city of Paris with 1 million people, which is the equivalent of Los Angeles with 20 million people. Given the communication system that they had, you couldn't go any faster than a horse. They had no telephones, they had no telegraph. The only way you could communicate was by letter, and as fast as a letter could be carried, or as fast as you could walk. And within that city of approximately, give or take, 1 million people, they divided the city of Paris during the height of the Great French Revolution in 1793 into 1794 into 48 sections. But these 48 sections, conceived of as neighborhoods, met in direct assemblies, each one of them, 48 assemblies called sections, occupying churches, occupying schools, occupying monasteries, where the citizenry assembled and in a face-to-face relationship discussed all the political affairs of the revolution, including matters of war and peace. And then on top of that established citizens' commissions, and none of them were paid, meeting in these assemblies to feed Paris. So they went out into the countryside and brought food in. This is the spontaneous movement of the people, not the National Convention or National Assembly, about which we hear so much history, the figures of Robespierre, Danton, Saint-Just, and so on and so forth. These were the people of the streets of Paris, the sans-culottes, those who did not have knee breeches but wore long trousers. That's what the word essentially meant, without culottes or breeches. With their red liberty caps, organizing their own militias, organizing their own revolutionary courts to fight the counter-revolution, feeding the city, making decisions, and then charging on the National Assembly and changing the whole course of the revolution, radicalizing it, and then finally they reached the ultimate. They wanted to form a France, not just a Paris, of a sectional face-to-face democracy. And the call went out from their committees, calling upon the other sections in other cities of Paris to combine with the French revolutionary sections and replace the national government completely. To dissolve the convention, which is what the National Assembly was called at that time, to kick out Robespierre. They called it the Third Revolution. The first revolution overthrew the monarchy. The second revolution got rid of the liberals. And now they were going to make a third revolution to get rid of the Jacobins and let France become a commune of communes, confederally organized in communes, and then locked into regions and real bioregions in every sense of the word. And then everything the higher up, if you want to use the word higher or lower in this kind of vocabulary, the higher up you went, the less power and the more administrative the commune became. This was a living experience for 2 years in France. It's not a theory. If I wrote this up, say under, instead of ecotopia, sectotopia, or something like that, people would say, what a wonderful daydream. But the French didn't daydream this thing. They created it. It moved that revolution. It supplied the revolutionary armies. It fed the city. It maintained the surveillance against the counter-revolutionaries and the aristocracy. It was real. So I'm not giving you utopia. It had to be suppressed. It had to be crushed. It is not that it died out. It had to be crushed and its leaders were sent to the guillotine. One thinks, for example, of the priest Jacques Roux. If any of you have ever seen, particularly the play by Peter Weiss, Marat Sade, Jacques Roux had to be sent. He committed suicide in prison. The Hébertistes were all guillotined, and Robespierre lost control or any influence of the sections, having cut off his left as well as his right. He was ready for himself to go to the guillotine. But I don't want to go into these details. That history has got to be recovered. We lost it. We've buried it. Or they have buried it so that we can't see it. And then there were the town meetings in New England, which then spread in the American Revolution, clear down the 13 colonies to Charleston. Most Americans don't know this. They don't know that town meetings spread all through the 13 colonies and had to be suppressed. That in Charleston, the merchant classes had to go ahead and reinstate the mayoral system in order to suppress the town meeting system. I'm not talking of New England. And they kept on doing that right up the 13 colonies until they came to Boston, when Sam Adams said, no, you'll have to do it over my dead body. And do you know what they did? They kept town meetings going in Boston right up to 1850, even when the city became too large to manage by one town meeting. I'm beginning to speed wrap a bit. There's so much to say in so little time. And then finally, they decentralized the town meetings, and they established one in every ward. These are forms of freedom. They are the suppressed and hidden forms of freedom that have been covered over and overlaid by the academy, by the apologists, by those who have been trying to manipulate our thinking as well as our lives. And so we only get them in fragments, and the story has yet to be told, as the story of women has yet to be told, as the story of blacks has yet to be told, as the story of Indian peoples has yet to be told, as the story of all oppressed people has yet to be told in all its richness and fullness, in the darkness, in the cellars of history as we know it today officially. Now, let me take it a step further, if I may, because this is where it's a matter of the deepest concern for me. We have tried, and in Europe particularly, they have tried to recreate again forms of freedom. The forms of freedom that they have tried to recreate have essentially been what they call generally in Europe the extra-parliamentary movements. And we tried to do very much of that in the 1930s and in the 1960s. In the 1930s, we tried to create labor movements that would become forms of freedom. In Spain, it reached its most fully developed form in the anarcho-syndicalist movement, where 2 million people out of 23 million in Spain belonged to the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, the National Confederation of Labor, or CNT, which has that black and red flag that you now associate with Sandina and the Sandinistas. Because Sandina himself was an anarcho-syndicalist. Their extra-parliamentary movement could take a very distinct form. They recreated it in the form of a tremendous trade union movement that swept in not only a large section of the working class of France, of Spain, prior to the Civil War, also the peasantry. 2 million. They did not have a single paid functionary to run those unions of 2 million people, except for their general secretary and their regional secretaries. They were given a worker's wage, and they usually were paid 2 or 3 weeks late so that they wouldn't get too encouraged in some bad monetary habits. Other than that, everything was done by the workers after working hours. After working hours. Most people do not know that history. A union of 2 million people without a damn single bureaucrat. The same developments began to occur even in the Russian Revolution. Again, the suppressed history of the Russian Revolution. That history was one in which shop workers established shop committees to take over the factories, and in which peasants established councils or soviets to take over the land. And they also met in shop assemblies and assumed such enormous strength that when Lenin, in the middle of 1917, felt that the Bolsheviks could not take control of the Soviets, demanded all power to the shop committees. That lasted 1 week, and then afterward things changed. But the shop committees were already becoming a parallel grassroots form of direct face-to-face democracy within the factories and to a very great extent on the land, and countervention to, as a countervailing force to the centralized government as it was led by Kerensky, and were to persist that way right up to 1921, even when the Bolsheviks took power. In 1921, they finally rose against the Bolsheviks and were smashed, and they too cried out the Third Revolution, without ever knowing that that same cry had come out of the Sans-Culotte almost 200 years earlier. The Tsar had been overthrown by one revolution, Kerensky had been overthrown by the second revolution, by the Bolsheviks, and now it was time to overthrow the Bolsheviks and put the power in the hands of the people with their local committees, their local council, their local assemblies. Our extra-parliamentary movement, too, began to develop, and with it began to develop a very important thing, a culture, a counterculture. And we still need a counterculture desperately. The feminists are trying to recover their own culture and develop their own culture. Peace activists are trying to develop, as well as opposition to the war, a culture based upon a different view of people, a different view of otherness, a different view of other experiences, not as something that is to be controlled and manipulated. Anti-militarism and pacifism today is not simply a movement, it is a culture. It is a culture of how you relate to animals. It's a culture of how you relate to other human beings. It is based on nonviolence. It counts on reason, sympathy, empathy, love. And by no means a word to be discarded today because it is used often so cynically. Like, I love my Ford or my Subaru. So we are talking in all these movements, or what the Germans call a Bewegung.